The Commonwealth Banking Corporation occupied 3 floors of the Mutual Life building on Martin Place, in the heart of Sydney's central business district. It was a prestigious address, one that conveyed stability and tradition, values that the banking industry in 1972 held as sacred truths. The building itself was an imposing structure of sandstone and glass, its facade decorated with Art Deco flourishes that spoke of an earlier, more elegant era. Men in dark suits moved through its corridors with briefcases and serious expressions, conducting the serious business of money with the gravity it deserved. Richard Ashford had worked at Commonwealth Banking for 18 years, rising through the ranks from junior accountant to senior executive in charge of the International Investment Division. At 42 years old, he was considered one of the bank's most reliable and skilled officers, a man who understood the complexities of international finance, and who had successfully navigated the bank through the turbulent economic changes of the late 1960s and early 1970s. His colleagues respected him. His superiors trusted him. His subordinates found him demanding, but fair. He lived in Mosman, on Sydney's affluent North Shore, in a handsome brick house with harbour views. His wife Catherine taught piano to children from wealthy families, supplementing Richard's substantial salary with income that allowed them small luxuries, overseas holidays, private school for their children, a new car every few years. Their daughter Victoria was 16 and studying for her higher school certificate. Their son James was 14 and showed promise as a cricket player. By any measure, the Ashfords were living the Australian dream, successful and secure, with a future that seemed comfortably predictable. But in the weeks leading up to August 15th, 1972, Richard Ashford's behavior had begun to change in ways that troubled those who knew him well. Catherine noticed that he seemed distracted at dinner, responding to questions with vague answers or not responding at all, lost in thoughts he did not share. He began working later hours, coming home after the children were in bed, smelling of cigarettes, though he claimed to have quit smoking years earlier. He made and received phone calls at odd hours, speaking in low tones that ceased when anyone entered the room. His secretary, Margaret Spencer, who had worked with him for 8 years, noticed that he seemed anxious, constantly checking his watch, starting at unexpected sounds, requesting that certain phone calls be held or diverted. He had always been meticulous about his calendar and his correspondence, but in recent weeks, he had missed meetings, forgotten appointments, and left letters unanswered on his desk. When Margaret gently inquired if everything was all right, he assured her that he was simply dealing with some complex transactions that required his full attention. She accepted this explanation but remained concerned. On the morning of August 15th, 1972, Richard arrived at the office at his usual time, 8:30 in the morning. He wore a charcoal gray suit with a dark blue tie, his shoes polished to a high shine, his hair neatly combed. He greeted Margaret with a distracted nod and closed himself in his office, requesting that he not be disturbed unless it was urgent. She brought him coffee at 10 o'clock and noticed that his desk was covered with files and ledgers, documents spread out in what appeared to be organized chaos. At noon, he emerged from his office and told Margaret that he was going out for lunch and would return within the hour. This was not unusual. Richard often lunched at one of the clubs on Pitt Street or met with clients at restaurants in the city. Margaret assumed this was another such meeting and thought nothing of it. He returned at 1:15, carrying his briefcase, and again closeted himself in his office. The afternoon passed quietly. Margaret answered phones, typed letters, filed documents. At 5 o'clock, she knocked on Richard's door to ask if he needed anything else before she left for the day. He looked up from his desk, his face pale and drawn, and told her that he would be working late and that she should go home. She wished him a good evening and left, taking the lift down to the ground floor and walking out into the late winter afternoon, already thinking about what she would prepare for her own dinner. At 5:30, Richard Ashford gathered several files from his desk, placed them in his briefcase, put on his overcoat, and left his office. The building's security guard, Peter Walsh, who had worked at the Mutual Life building for 12 years, saw Richard pass through the lobby and exit onto Martin Place. Walsh noted the time in his log, as he did for all senior executives who worked late. It was the last confirmed sighting of Richard Ashford. When Richard did not come home that evening, Catherine was initially more annoyed than worried. He had been working late frequently, and she assumed he had gone to dinner with colleagues or clients and had simply forgotten to telephone. But when 10 o'clock came and went with no word, her annoyance turned to concern. She tried calling his office, but there was no answer. She called the homes of several colleagues, waking some of them, but none had seen Richard since earlier in the day. By midnight, Catherine's concern had become genuine fear. She called the Mosman police station and reported that her husband had not come home and could not be reached. The duty officer took her information and promised that someone would follow up in the morning if Richard had not appeared by then. Catherine spent the night sitting in the living room, watching the door, waiting for the sound of Richard's key in the lock. It never came. The next morning, August 16th, Catherine called Commonwealth Banking and asked to speak with Gerald Pemberton, the bank's president. Pemberton listened to her frantic explanation and assured her that he would look into the matter immediately. He hung up and called for Richard's personnel file, then summoned the head of security and the chief auditor to his office. What they discovered over the next several hours sent shockwaves through the bank and would eventually become one of Australia's most notorious financial scandals and unsolved mysteries. Richard Ashford, trusted senior executive, had systematically embezzled approximately 2.3 million Australian dollars from various corporate accounts under his supervision. The theft had been carried out over a period of at least 6 months, using a complex series of transfers and false documentation that demonstrated both sophistication and detailed planning. The money had been moved through a series of accounts in Sydney, then transferred to banks in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Switzerland. The final destination of the funds could not immediately be determined. Pemberton, his face ashen, ordered that the matter be kept absolutely confidential, while they determined the full extent of the damage, but he also knew they would have to contact the authorities. By noon, Detective Inspector Malcolm Brisbane of the New South Wales Police Force was sitting in Pemberton's office, listening to an explanation that became more damning with each sentence. Brisbane was a veteran investigator in his early 50s, with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of a man who had seen humanity at its worst. He had worked fraud cases before, but nothing of this magnitude. He asked to see Richard Ashford's office and was escorted to the 3rd floor by Pemberton and the head of security. The office was neat and orderly, the desk cleared of papers, the files organized in drawers. Brisbane noticed immediately that the office had been thoroughly cleaned, as though someone had deliberately removed any evidence that might provide clues to their whereabouts or intentions. Brisbane ordered that the office be sealed, and that no one be permitted entry until his forensic team had examined every inch of it. He then requested a list of everyone who had access to the office, and everyone who had spoken with or seen Richard Ashford in the days before his disappearance. He also requested all of Richard's personnel records, financial records, and any documentation related to the embezzled funds. By late afternoon, Brisbane had assembled a team of detectives and begun the painstaking work of investigating Richard Ashford's disappearance. They interviewed Catherine Ashford at length, taking detailed notes about Richard's behavior in recent weeks, his work habits, his friendships, his financial situation. Catherine, devastated and confused, insisted that Richard would never steal from anyone, that there must be some mistake or some explanation. She suggested that he might have been kidnapped, that criminals might be forcing him to access the bank's funds under threat of violence. Brisbane listened sympathetically, but knew from experience that the evidence painted a different picture. Men who were kidnapped did not carefully plan transfers of funds over a period of months. Men who were kidnapped did not clean out their offices before disappearing. Everything about the case suggested that Richard Ashford had planned his disappearance carefully and had left with the intention of never returning. The investigation expanded rapidly. Brisbane's team interviewed every employee at Commonwealth Banking who had worked with or near Richard Ashford. They examined his bank records, his phone records, his travel history. They discovered that Richard had recently obtained a new passport, claiming that his previous one had been lost. They discovered that he had been making inquiries about property in several countries, including Brazil, which had no extradition treaty with Australia. They discovered that he had withdrawn $20,000 in cash from his personal account over the previous 2 months, always in small amounts that would not attract attention. The press got hold of the story within 48 hours, and it exploded across Sydney's newspapers with sensational headlines about a respected banker who had stolen millions and vanished without a trace. Reporters camped outside the Ashford home in Mosman, harassing Catherine and the children every time they left the house. The story was picked up by interstate newspapers, then by international media. Richard Ashford's photograph appeared on the front page of papers from Melbourne to London, always accompanied by speculation about where he had gone and what he had done with the money. Brisbane's investigation uncovered a crucial piece of information on the 3rd day. A taxi driver named Frank Morrison came forward after seeing Richard's photograph in the newspaper. Morrison stated that he had picked up a fare matching Richard's description at Martin Place on the evening of August 15th at approximately 5:45 in the evening. The passenger had asked to be taken to Sydney Airport at Mascot. Morrison remembered the fare clearly because the man had been nervous and had asked him to take a route that avoided the main roads, claiming he was in a hurry and wanted to avoid traffic. The trip had taken approximately 35 minutes, and Morrison had dropped his passenger at the international terminal at around 6:20 in the evening. Brisbane immediately focused his investigation on the airport. He obtained passenger manifests for all international flights departing Sydney on the evening of August 15th and the morning of August 16th. No passenger named Richard Ashford appeared on any of the lists, but Brisbane was experienced enough to know that a man planning to disappear would not travel under his own name. He requested surveillance footage from the airport, only to be told that the cameras in the international terminal had not been operational on that evening due to technical difficulties. This seemed like an almost impossibly convenient coincidence, and Brisbane made a note to investigate whether the camera malfunction had been deliberate sabotage. Working with the Australian Federal Police and Interpol, Brisbane began the tedious process of checking passenger lists against photographs of Richard Ashford, looking for anyone who might have been traveling on a false passport. This process took weeks and yielded nothing definitive. Several passengers matched Richard's general description, but without being able to examine the actual passports or interview the passengers, it was impossible to confirm whether any of them had been Richard Ashford traveling under an assumed identity. Meanwhile, David Chen, the forensic auditor hired by Commonwealth Banking, was tracing the path of the embezzled funds through the international banking system. What he discovered was both impressive and frustrating. The money had been moved through a complex network of accounts, each transfer designed to obscure the trail and make recovery difficult if not impossible. Some of the funds had gone to Hong Kong, where they had been converted to Hong Kong dollars and then moved to accounts in Singapore. Other funds had gone directly to Switzerland, deposited in numbered accounts that were protected by Swiss banking secrecy laws. Chen worked with banking authorities in multiple countries, requesting information and cooperation in tracking the funds. Progress was slow. International banking regulations in 1972 were not as coordinated as they would later become, and each country had its own rules about disclosure and cooperation with foreign investigators. Switzerland, in particular, was notoriously uncooperative when it came to revealing information about numbered accounts. By September, Brisbane's investigation had generated hundreds of pages of reports and interviews, but had produced no solid leads on Richard Ashford's whereabouts. The trail had gone cold at the airport. Without surveillance footage, without a confirmed passenger list entry, without any witnesses who could place Richard on a specific flight, Brisbane had reached a dead end. He expanded the investigation to include possible domestic destinations, considering the possibility that Richard had not left Australia immediately, but had gone to ground somewhere within the country, waiting for the initial heat of the investigation to die down before attempting to leave. Police in every Australian state were alerted to watch for Richard Ashford. His photograph was distributed to hotels, motels, boarding houses, and rental agencies. Banks were instructed to report any attempt to access Richard's accounts or to conduct transactions that might be connected to him. Boarders were alerted, though Brisbane knew that if Richard had already left the country, this precaution was closing the gate after the horse had bolted. Catherine Ashford, meanwhile, was living a nightmare. She had been forced to withdraw Victoria and James from their private schools due to the scandal and the harassment they faced from other students and parents. The family's financial situation was precarious. Richard's salary had stopped, obviously, and the bank had frozen all of the family's joint accounts pending the investigation. Catherine's income from piano lessons was not sufficient to maintain the Mosman house, and she was facing the very real possibility of having to sell the house and move somewhere more affordable. But beyond the financial stress, Catherine was dealing with the emotional devastation of having her entire life upended. She had been married to Richard for 18 years and had believed she knew him completely. The idea that he had been secretly embezzling millions of dollars, planning an escape, constructing an entirely false life while appearing to be a devoted husband and father, was incomprehensible to her. She swung between believing that he had been kidnapped or forced into this situation, and facing the horrible possibility that the man she had loved and trusted had been living a lie for years. Victoria and James were equally traumatized. Victoria, who had been planning to attend university the following year, now faced an uncertain future. She was angry at her father for destroying their family, but also desperately worried about what had happened to him. James withdrew into himself, refusing to talk about his father, spending hours alone in his room. The family that had seemed so stable and happy just weeks earlier was now fractured and struggling to survive. Brisbane visited Catherine regularly, updating her on the investigation and asking if she had remembered any additional details that might be helpful. He asked about Richard's friends, his hobbies, his interests outside of work. Catherine mentioned that Richard had been interested in sailing and had occasionally gone out on Sydney Harbour with a group of men from a sailing club in Rose Bay. Brisbane made a note to follow up on this. The investigation into Richard's sailing connections led Brisbane to a man named Kenneth Barrett, who owned a 40-foot yacht and who had taken Richard out sailing several times over the previous year. Barrett, a businessman in his 50s who had made his fortune in property development, was initially reluctant to speak with police, but Brisbane persuaded him that cooperation was in everyone's best interest. Barrett admitted that he had known Richard socially and had enjoyed his company on sailing trips, but he insisted he knew nothing about Richard's personal or financial affairs and had no idea that Richard had been involved in any criminal activity. When Brisbane pressed him about the most recent sailing trip, Barrett hesitated before admitting that Richard had gone out with him in early August, about a week before he disappeared. Richard had seemed distracted and had asked Barrett several questions about sailing long distances, about provisioning a boat for extended trips, about ports in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. At the time, Barrett had assumed Richard was considering buying a boat of his own and was gathering information. But in retrospect, Barrett admitted, it seemed possible that Richard had been contemplating escape by sea. Brisbane felt a surge of excitement at this possibility. If Richard had stolen a boat or chartered a vessel, he could have sailed out of Sydney without passing through any airport or official border checkpoint. Brisbane immediately expanded his investigation to include all boat thefts, boat rentals, and unusual boat departures from Sydney in the days surrounding Richard's disappearance. This line of investigation produced several interesting leads, but no definitive answers. 2 boats had been reported stolen from Sydney marinas in mid-August, but both were later recovered, and neither showed any evidence of having been used by Richard Ashford. Several charter companies reported bookings from men who matched Richard's general description. But again, none could be definitively confirmed as Richard traveling under a false identity. Brisbane began to feel the frustration that accompanied all cold cases, the sense that the answer was just beyond reach, that one more piece of information, one more witness, one more lucky break would crack the case wide open. But that breakthrough never came. Weeks turned into months. The investigation gradually lost momentum as other cases demanded attention and resources. By the end of 1972, the Richard Ashford case had been officially designated as unsolved and was transferred to the Cold Case Division. Catherine Ashford eventually had to sell the Mosman house and move with Victoria and James to a small flat in Chatswood. Victoria postponed her university plans and took a job as a secretary to help support the family. James struggled through his remaining years of school, carrying the stigma of being the son of a notorious criminal. The family was effectively destroyed by Richard's actions, their lives permanently altered by his betrayal and his disappearance. But the story did not end there. Over the years that followed, there were periodic reports of Richard Ashford sightings from various locations around the world. In 1975, an Australian tourist in Rio de Janeiro reported seeing a man who looked exactly like Richard at a restaurant in Copacabana. Police in Brazil investigated but found no evidence to support the sighting. In 1978, a businessman in Singapore claimed to have been introduced to someone at a social function who he later realized matched Richard's description. Again, investigation yielded nothing concrete. In 1981, David Chen, the forensic auditor who had traced the embezzled funds, made a disturbing discovery. Several of the Swiss accounts that had received transfers from the embezzled funds showed activity that suggested someone was still accessing them. Small amounts of money were being withdrawn periodically, amounts that would not attract attention, but that over time added up to significant sums. Chen reported this to Brisbane, who by then had retired from active duty, but maintained an interest in the case. Brisbane contacted Swiss banking authorities and requested information about the account activity. But as always, Switzerland was uncooperative. Without evidence of ongoing criminal activity, and without a court order from a Swiss court, the banks would not release information about their clients. Brisbane was forced to accept that Richard Ashford, if he was indeed still alive and accessing the accounts, was beyond the reach of Australian law enforcement. In 1987, Catherine Ashford died of cancer at the age of 53. She had never remarried, never fully recovered from the trauma of Richard's betrayal and disappearance. Victoria and James, now adults with lives of their own, attended their mother's funeral and wondered privately whether their father knew that his wife was dead, whether he cared, whether he ever thought about the family he had destroyed. The case experienced a brief resurgence of interest in 1997, when a Melbourne journalist named Sarah Patterson began researching unsolved crimes from the 1970s for a book she was writing. Patterson interviewed Malcolm Brisbane, now in his 70s, and living in retirement on the Central Coast. Brisbane shared his files and his memories with Patterson, and she devoted an entire chapter of her book to the Richard Ashford case. The book, titled Vanished, Australia's Most Baffling Unsolved Mysteries, was published in 1998 and became a modest bestseller. The chapter on Richard Ashford generated renewed public interest in the case and prompted several new witness reports. A woman in Perth claimed that her former neighbor in the early 1980s had been Richard Ashford living under an assumed name. Police investigated but could not verify her claim, as the neighbor had moved away years earlier and could not be located. In 2003, a significant development occurred. A man named Trevor Hansen, who had worked as a junior clerk at Commonwealth Banking in the early 1970s, came forward with information he claimed to have withheld during the original investigation. Hansen, now in his 50s and dying of emphysema, said that his conscience had been troubling him and that he wanted to tell the truth before he died. According to Hansen, Richard Ashford had not been working alone. Hansen claimed that Richard had been involved with a sophisticated international criminal organization that specialized in facilitating financial crimes and providing escape services for white-collar criminals. Hansen said he had overheard conversations between Richard and another man, whom he could not identify, discussing arrangements for Richard's departure and the movement of funds. Hansen had been too frightened to come forward at the time, fearing that the criminal organization would harm him or his family if he spoke to police. This information, if accurate, cast the entire case in a new light. If Richard had indeed been working with an organized criminal network, it would explain the sophistication of the embezzlement scheme and the thoroughness of his disappearance. It would also suggest that Richard might not have kept all of the embezzled funds for himself, but might have been required to share a significant portion with his criminal associates as payment for their assistance. Police investigated Hansen's claims, but found it difficult to verify them so many years after the fact. Most of the people who had worked at Commonwealth Banking in 1972 were retired or deceased. Records from that era had been largely destroyed or lost. Without corroborating evidence, Hansen's testimony remained interesting, but not conclusive. Trevor Hansen died in 2004, taking with him any additional information he might have possessed. The Richard Ashford case returned to obscurity, relegated to the archives of unsolved crimes, occasionally mentioned in true crime documentaries or online forums dedicated to mysterious disappearances. In 2010, a researcher named Dr. Emily Morrison, who specialized in financial crimes and white-collar criminal behavior, began an academic study of the Richard Ashford case. Morrison was intrigued by the psychological profile of a man who could live a double life so successfully, who could steal millions while maintaining the appearance of a respectable family man, who could abandon his wife and children without apparent remorse. Morrison obtained access to all of the case files, interviewed everyone still living who had known Richard, and constructed a detailed timeline of his activities in the months before his disappearance. What emerged from her research was a portrait of a man under intense pressure, a man who had made poor investment decisions on behalf of the bank, and who had found himself facing professional ruin and possible criminal charges unless he could cover his losses. The embezzlement, Morrison theorized, had begun not as a planned theft, but as a desperate attempt to hide his mistakes and buy time to recover the losses. But once Richard started stealing, Morrison suggested, he found himself caught in a spiral that he could not escape. Each theft required another theft to cover it. Each lie required another lie to support it. Eventually, Richard must have realized that his crimes would inevitably be discovered, and that his only option was to take as much money as he could and disappear before the authorities closed in. Morrison's study, published in an academic journal in 2011, provided valuable insights into the psychology of white-collar crime, but did not answer the fundamental question of what had happened to Richard Ashford. Was he still alive, living under a false identity somewhere in the world, perhaps in a country with no extradition treaty with Australia? Had he died years ago, his body lost or never identified, his stolen millions sitting in Swiss bank accounts that would never be claimed? Or had he met with some violent end at the hands of criminal associates who decided he was a liability? Victoria Ashford, now in her 50s and living in Brisbane with her own family, granted an interview to a television documentary about the case in 2015. She spoke carefully and with obvious pain about her father, about the man she had known and loved, about the betrayal that had shattered her family. She said that she had long ago accepted that she would never know what had happened to her father or why he had done what he did. She said she had forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own, because carrying anger and pain for more than 40 years was simply too exhausting. James Ashford refused to be interviewed. He had changed his name years earlier and had built a life that had nothing to do with his father or the scandal that had defined his adolescence. He wanted no part of any documentary or any renewed attention to the case. In 2018, a significant technological development provided new hope for solving old cases. Advances in facial recognition software and the digitization of historical photographs and documents made it possible to search databases more effectively than ever before. The New South Wales Police Force initiated a cold case review project, using modern technology to re-examine unsolved cases from previous decades. The Richard Ashford case was one of dozens selected for review. Investigators used facial recognition software to search through thousands of passport photographs, immigration records, and identification documents from multiple countries, looking for anyone who might match Richard's facial structure, allowing for age progression. The search was exhaustive, but ultimately inconclusive. Several possible matches were identified, but none could be definitively confirmed as Richard Ashford. One of the most promising leads came from New Zealand immigration records from 1973. A man traveling on a British passport under the name Robert Atkins had entered New Zealand in January of that year and had remained in the country for approximately 3 months before departing for Fiji. The passport photograph showed a man who bore a strong resemblance to Richard Ashford, though with different hair and glasses. When investigators attempted to trace Robert Atkins further, they discovered that the passport had been reported stolen in London in 1971. This suggested that someone, possibly Richard, had been using the stolen passport to travel under a false identity, but the trail ended in Fiji. No records could be found of Robert Atkins departing Fiji or entering any other country. He had simply vanished, as completely as Richard Ashford had vanished from Sydney in August of 1972. Whether Robert Atkins and Richard Ashford were the same person remained a matter of speculation. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted investigations worldwide, and the Cold Case Review Project was suspended indefinitely. The Richard Ashford case returned to the archives, its mysteries unresolved, its questions unanswered. Detective Inspector Malcolm Brisbane died in 2021 at the age of 94, having spent nearly 50 years thinking about the case that had defined the latter part of his career. In interviews conducted shortly before his death, Brisbane expressed his belief that Richard Ashford had successfully escaped Australia, had lived for many years under a false identity, and had likely died of natural causes at some point in the late 20th or early 21st century. Brisbane said he bore no ill will toward Richard, only sadness for the family that had been destroyed, and frustration that justice had never been served. Catherine Ashford's grave in the cemetery at Chatswood bore a simple headstone with her name and dates. There was no mention of Richard, no indication that she had been married. Victoria visited occasionally, bringing flowers, standing in silence at her mother's grave, thinking about the choices people make and the consequences that ripple through time, destroying lives and families long after the initial action has been taken. The $2.3 million that Richard Ashford had embezzled in 1972 would be worth approximately $20 million in current currency. Commonwealth Banking had recovered none of it. The bank had written off the loss, absorbed it into their operating expenses, and moved on. For a major bank, it was a significant, but not catastrophic loss. For the Ashford family, it had been the end of everything they knew. The case remained technically open, though no active investigation was ongoing. Richard Ashford's name remained in databases of wanted criminals, though by now he would be in his 90s if still alive. An old man carrying secrets that only he knew, living a life built on lies and stolen money, or perhaps dead and buried somewhere under a false name, his true identity lost forever. The mystery endured, unsolved, and perhaps unsolvable. The questions remained. Where did Richard Ashford go? How did he escape so completely? Did he work alone or with criminal associates? What happened to the money? Is he still alive somewhere, living out his final years with the weight of his crimes and his betrayals? Or did he die years ago, his secrets dying with him? The answers, if they exist at all, remain hidden in the shadows of history, in the archives of banks that will never reveal their secrets, in the memories of people who are now dead, in the silence of a man who walked out of his office on Martin Place on an August evening in 1972 and disappeared into legend and mystery, leaving behind only grief and questions and the eternal human fascination with those who vanish without a trace, who slip through the cracks of society and geography and law, who become ghosts haunting the edges of history, forever pursued but never caught, forever sought but never found. The story of Richard Ashford had become one of those enduring mysteries that captured public imagination, precisely because it remained unsolved. In an age where surveillance cameras and digital footprints made it increasingly difficult to disappear completely, the fact that a man had vanished so thoroughly in 1972 seemed almost quaint, a relic from a simpler time when borders were more porous and identities more fluid. What the public did not know, what even Detective Inspector Malcolm Brisbane had not fully understood during his investigation, was that Richard Ashford's disappearance was connected to something much larger and more sinister than a simple case of embezzlement and flight. The truth, buried in classified files and whispered conversations, involved international organized crime, political corruption, and connections that reached into the highest levels of Australian business and government. In 2023, a researcher named Dr. Marcus Wellington, who specialized in financial crime history, began examining declassified documents from the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation related to organized crime activities in the 1970s. Among thousands of pages of documents, Wellington discovered a file marked Operation Shepherd, which had been initiated in 1971 to investigate suspected money laundering activities involving Sydney-based financial institutions. The file made multiple references to Commonwealth banking, and specifically mentioned concerns about certain executives whose lifestyle and spending patterns did not match their reported income. Richard Ashford's name appeared in 3 separate intelligence reports, noted as a person of interest who might be facilitating the movement of criminal funds through international banking channels. The report suggested that ASIO had been building a case against Richard and several other banking executives, but that the investigation had been suspended abruptly in late 1972 for reasons that were heavily redacted in the declassified documents. Wellington, intrigued by what he had found, began digging deeper into Operation Shepherd and the network of individuals connected to it. He discovered that the investigation had been compromised by leaks from within ASIO itself, with classified information apparently being passed to the subjects of the investigation. Several key witnesses had refused to cooperate, or had recanted their testimony. Physical evidence had gone missing from secure storage facilities. The operation had collapsed not because of lack of evidence, but because of what appeared to be deliberate sabotage. Among the documents Wellington found was a surveillance report from July 19, 1972, less than a month before Richard Ashford's disappearance. ASIO agents had observed Richard meeting with a man identified only as Subject 12 at a restaurant in King's Cross. The meeting had lasted approximately 90 minutes, and observers noted that Richard appeared agitated and that Subject 12 had handed him a manila envelope. The agents had attempted to identify Subject 12, but had been unsuccessful. The man had no criminal record, no documented identity that could be traced, and had apparently entered and left Australia using false documentation. Wellington cross-referenced the date and location with other historical records and discovered something remarkable. On the same evening that Richard had met with Subject 12, a prominent Sydney businessman named Douglas Fairchild had died in what was officially ruled an accidental drowning at his Vaucluse home. Fairchild had been a director of several companies and had served on the board of Commonwealth Banking until resigning abruptly 2 months earlier, citing health reasons. The official investigation into Fairchild's death had concluded that he had been drinking heavily, had gone for a swim in his pool, and had suffered a heart attack or become disoriented and drowned. But Wellington noticed several anomalies in the police report. Neighbors had reported hearing raised voices and sounds of a struggle coming from the Fairchild property earlier that evening. A security guard at a nearby property had seen two men leaving the Fairchild residence around the estimated time of death, though this information appeared to have been given minimal weight in the investigation. Wellington began to construct a hypothesis. What if Douglas Fairchild had been involved in the same criminal network as Richard Ashford? What if Fairchild had decided to cooperate with authorities or had threatened to expose the network? What if his death had been not an accident, but a murder designed to look like an accident? A warning to others who might consider betraying the organization. If this hypothesis was correct, it would cast Richard Ashford's disappearance in an entirely new light. Perhaps Richard had not fled because he was afraid of being prosecuted for embezzlement. Perhaps he had fled because he feared for his life, because he knew what had happened to Douglas Fairchild and understood that he could be next. The meeting with Subject 12 might have been Richard's attempt to negotiate his own escape. With a manila envelope containing either payment for assistance or documents necessary for establishing a new identity, Wellington published his findings in a lengthy article in the Australian Journal of Criminal History in 2024. The article generated significant controversy and was covered extensively in mainstream media. Commonwealth Banking, now operating under a different name after multiple mergers and reorganizations, issued a statement denying any historical connection to organized crime and characterizing Wellington's research as speculative and unsupported by definitive evidence. But Wellington's article had struck a nerve. Within weeks, he began receiving anonymous communications from individuals claiming to have information about Richard Ashford and the events of 1972. Most of these communications were vague or unreliable, but a few contained specific details that Wellington was able to verify independently. One communication came from a woman who identified herself only as Margaret S., and who claimed to have been Richard Ashford's secretary. This was, of course, Margaret Spencer, now in her late 70s and living in a retirement home in Newcastle. Margaret had followed the media coverage of Wellington's article and had decided that after more than 50 years, she could finally share information she had kept secret out of fear for her own safety. Wellington traveled to Newcastle to interview Margaret in person. What she told him filled in crucial gaps in the narrative and confirmed several of his suspicions. According to Margaret, Richard had been under tremendous pressure in the months before his disappearance, not just from work stress, but from outside forces that he never fully explained to her. He had received threatening phone calls that left him visibly shaken. He had been followed on several occasions by men in dark cars. He had confided in Margaret that he had made terrible mistakes and had gotten involved with the wrong people, and that he feared he would never be able to extricate himself. Margaret said that on the morning of August 15th, Richard had received a phone call that had clearly upset him greatly. After hanging up, he had sat at his desk with his head in his hands for several minutes. When Margaret asked if he was all right, he had looked at her with what she described as absolute despair and said, "It is too late now. Whatever happens, I want you to know that I never meant for any of this. I was trying to fix things, but I only made them worse." These words had haunted Margaret for more than 50 years. She had not reported them to police during the original investigation because she had been frightened, uncertain what Richard had been involved in, afraid that if she revealed too much, she might put herself in danger. But now, as an old woman with nothing left to fear, she wanted the truth to be known. Margaret also revealed something that had never appeared in any police report or media coverage. On the afternoon of August 15th, shortly before Richard left the office for the last time, a man had come to see him. Margaret had not recognized the visitor, and Richard had not introduced him. The two men had closeted themselves in Richard's office for approximately 20 minutes. When the visitor left, Margaret had gotten a good look at his face. She described him as being in his 40s, with dark hair, a European accent, and an air of quiet menace. Years later, Margaret had seen a photograph in a newspaper of a man who had been arrested for involvement in international drug trafficking and money laundering. She was certain it was the same man who had visited Richard's office that afternoon. The man's name was Viktor Sokolov, and he was identified as a member of a Soviet-organized crime network that had been operating in Australia since the late 1960s. Sokolov had been deported to the Soviet Union in 1978 after serving 5 years in prison for various financial crimes. Wellington tracked down what records still existed of Viktor Sokolov's criminal activities. Sokolov had been involved in a sophisticated operation that moved money from legitimate Australian businesses to offshore accounts, where it was laundered and distributed to criminal enterprises across Europe and Asia. The operation had involved bribing bank officials, creating false documentation, and establishing complex networks of shell companies. Several Australian bankers and businessmen had been implicated in the scheme, though most had escaped prosecution due to lack of evidence, or because they had cooperated with authorities in exchange for immunity. The pieces were beginning to form a coherent picture. Richard Ashford had likely been recruited or coerced into facilitating money laundering operations through his position at Commonwealth Banking. Perhaps he had been approached with promises of financial reward, or perhaps he had been blackmailed with threats to himself or his family. Either way, he had found himself deeply entangled with dangerous criminals who would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their operations. When Richard's embezzlement was about to be discovered, either because of routine audits or because ASIO's investigation was getting too close, Richard had been faced with impossible choices. He could go to the authorities and likely face both prosecution and retaliation from the criminal network. He could wait to be arrested and hope that he could negotiate some kind of deal, or he could disappear, using resources provided by the criminal network in exchange for his continued silence and cooperation. The evidence suggested that Richard had chosen the third option, or perhaps that the choice had been made for him by Viktor Sokolov and his associates. The meeting on the afternoon of August 15th had likely been Richard receiving his final instructions and the means to escape. The manila envelope observed by ASIO agents a month earlier had probably contained either money or documents necessary for establishing a false identity. But there was another, darker possibility that Wellington could not ignore. What if Richard Ashford had never actually escaped? What if the entire disappearance had been staged to make it appear that Richard had fled with the embezzled money, when in fact he had been murdered and his body disposed of in a way that would prevent it from ever being found? This would explain why no confirmed sightings of Richard had ever been verified, why the trail had gone so completely cold, why even sophisticated modern investigations had failed to locate him. If Richard had been murdered, it would have served multiple purposes for the criminal organization. It would eliminate someone who possessed dangerous knowledge about their operations. It would provide a convenient scapegoat for the missing money, diverting attention from the organization itself, and it would send a message to others who might consider betraying them. Wellington found himself torn between these two possibilities. The evidence could support either interpretation. Richard might be living somewhere under a false identity, an old man carrying 50 years of secrets and guilt, or he might have been dead since August 15th, 1972, his body long since reduced to nothing, his family mourning a man they never really knew. Wellington's research prompted a new investigation by the New South Wales Police Force Cold Case Unit in 2024. Detective Senior Constable Lisa Nguyen was assigned to review the case using modern investigative techniques and the new information that Wellington had uncovered. Nguyen was in her mid-30s, highly skilled in forensic analysis and cold case methodology, and determined to find answers that had eluded investigators for more than 5 decades. Nguyen began by re-interviewing everyone still living who had been connected to the original case. She spoke with Victoria Ashford Thompson, Richard's daughter, who was now 68 years old and still living in Brisbane. Victoria had spent her entire adult life trying to understand what her father had done and why. She had alternated between anger at his betrayal and sympathy for what he might have suffered. She wanted answers, even if those answers were painful. Nguyen also tracked down several former employees of Commonwealth Banking who had worked with Richard in the early 1970s. Most were elderly, and their memories were faded, but a few remembered details that added to the growing picture of a man under tremendous pressure, involved in activities he did not fully control, caught between legitimate business and criminal enterprise. One particularly valuable interview was with a man named Thomas Ridley, who had been an auditor at Commonwealth Banking in 1972, and who had been one of the first people to discover evidence of Richard's embezzlement. Ridley, now in his late 70s and living in Melbourne, remembered that he had found the irregularities almost by accident while reviewing routine quarterly reports. When he brought his concerns to his superiors, he had been told to keep the information confidential, while they determined the extent of the problem. But Ridley revealed something that had never been included in the official record. Before the embezzlement was officially discovered, Ridley had received a phone call at his home late one evening from someone who warned him to stop asking questions about things that are none of your business, and suggested that it would be unfortunate if anything happened to your family. Ridley had been terrified and had briefly considered dropping his investigation, but his sense of professional responsibility had prevailed. He had reported the threat to his superiors, but as far as he knew, no investigation into the threat had ever been conducted. This suggested that the criminal organization had been aware that the embezzlement was about to be discovered and had been taking steps to manage the situation. The threat to Ridley had been intended to delay or prevent the revelation, buying time for Richard to escape or be eliminated. When that had failed, Richard's disappearance had become necessary. Nguyen compiled all of this new information into a comprehensive report and presented it to her superiors with a recommendation that the case be reclassified from missing person and fraud to possible homicide. If Richard Ashford had been murdered, his killers should be identified and prosecuted, even if 50 years had passed. Murder had no statute of limitations. Her recommendation was accepted, and the case was formally reclassified in October 2024. This reclassification meant that additional resources could be devoted to the investigation, and that techniques normally reserved for homicide cases, such as forensic archaeology and advanced DNA analysis, could be employed. Nguyen focused her attention on the possibility that Richard's body had been disposed of shortly after his disappearance. Bodies disposed of in the ocean, buried in remote locations, or destroyed through fire or chemical means, could remain undiscovered for decades. But with modern technology, there was always a chance that evidence might still exist. She reviewed records of construction projects in the Sydney area in the months following Richard's disappearance, looking for any sites where a body might have been buried before the area was built over. She examined records of boat departures, looking for vessels that might have been used to transport a body out to sea. She consulted with forensic experts about the most likely disposal methods that would have been available in 1972. One lead proved particularly intriguing. In September 1972, just weeks after Richard's disappearance, a construction crew working on a new commercial development in Parramatta had reported finding what they believed to be human remains while excavating for a foundation. The police had been called, but the remains had been examined and determined to be animal bones, possibly from a cow or sheep. The incident had been documented, but not investigated further. Nguyen requested the original report and noted several anomalies. The examination of the bones had been cursory, conducted on site by a junior officer with no forensic training. The bones had not been sent to a laboratory for proper analysis. No photographs had been taken. The location had been noted imprecisely, making it difficult to determine exactly where the bones had been found. In 2024, the site was occupied by a shopping center that had been built in the 1980s. Nguyen obtained permission to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys of the area, looking for any evidence of disturbed earth or buried objects that might indicate a grave site. The surveys revealed several anomalies beneath the parking lot, areas where the soil density differed from surrounding areas in ways that suggested something had been buried there. With permission from the property owner and with appropriate legal authorization, Nguyen arranged for a limited excavation of the most promising site. A team of forensic archaeologists carefully removed layers of asphalt and concrete and began excavating the soil beneath. At a depth of approximately 2 meters, they found fragments of bone that appeared to be human. The bones were carefully excavated and transported to the forensic laboratory for analysis. DNA extraction from bones that had been buried for more than 50 years was difficult, but not impossible, with modern techniques. Over several months, the laboratory worked to extract usable DNA from the bone fragments and to construct a genetic profile that could be compared against known relatives of Richard Ashford. In March 2025, the results came back. The bones were indeed human, and the DNA profile was a familial match to Victoria Ashford Thompson. The bones belonged to a male individual who had been approximately 40 to 50 years old at the time of death, and who had died sometime in the early 1970s. The remains were almost certainly those of Richard Ashford. Further forensic analysis revealed additional details. The bones showed evidence of trauma consistent with blunt force injury to the skull, suggesting that Richard had been struck in the head with a heavy object. This was likely the cause of death. The bones had been buried hastily and shallowly, covered with quicklime in an apparent attempt to accelerate decomposition. The burial site had been chosen because construction was imminent, with the builders assuming that the grave would be buried under concrete and asphalt and would never be discovered. Victoria Ashford Thompson was informed of the discovery in a meeting with Detective Nguyen. After more than 50 years of not knowing, she finally had an answer. Her father had not abandoned the family and fled with stolen money. He had been murdered, likely by the criminal organization he had been involved with, and his body had been hidden in a way designed to make it appear that he had disappeared voluntarily. Victoria wept when she received the news, tears that contained both grief and relief. Grief for the father she had lost, and for the violent manner of his death. Relief that the questions that had haunted her entire life finally had answers. Her father had not chosen to abandon them. He had been a victim as well as a perpetrator, caught up in something beyond his control, paying the ultimate price for mistakes he had tried to rectify. The discovery of Richard's remains transformed the investigation once again. This was now definitively a murder case, and Nguyen was determined to identify and prosecute those responsible, even though more than 50 years had passed since the crime. She focused her attention on Viktor Sokolov, the Soviet organized crime figure who had visited Richard's office on the day of his disappearance. Sokolov had been deported to the Soviet Union in 1978 and had disappeared from Western intelligence records after that. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of previously classified archives, it might be possible to trace what had happened to him. Nguyen contacted law enforcement agencies in Russia and requested any information available about Viktor Sokolov. After months of bureaucratic delay, she received a response indicating that Sokolov had died in Moscow in 1993 of natural causes. He had lived the last 15 years of his life as a relatively obscure figure, operating small-time criminal enterprises, his glory days as an international crime figure long behind him. If Sokolov was dead, and if he had been the one who ordered or carried out Richard's murder, then justice in the conventional sense was impossible. The murderer was beyond the reach of Australian law, dead for more than 30 years. But Nguyen was not ready to close the case. Sokolov might be dead, but there had to have been others involved. Murder, burial, and cover-up required multiple people. Some of those people might still be alive. Nguyen combed through intelligence files and criminal records from the 1970s, looking for known associates of Viktor Sokolov, who had operated in Sydney during the relevant time period. She identified several individuals who had been suspected of involvement in Sokolov's criminal network, but who had never been successfully prosecuted. Most were now elderly or deceased, but a few were still alive. One name stood out: Leonard Garrison, who had been a businessman with suspected ties to organized crime in the 1970s. Garrison had been investigated multiple times, but had always managed to avoid prosecution, protected by skilled lawyers and by what many suspected was corruption within law enforcement. Now in his 80s and living in retirement on the Gold Coast, Garrison had largely faded from public view. Nguyen traveled to Queensland to interview Garrison. She found him living in a luxurious apartment overlooking the ocean, apparently enjoying a comfortable retirement, funded by decades of criminal profits that had never been successfully seized or prosecuted. Garrison was initially hostile and refused to answer questions, but when Nguyen informed him that Richard Ashford's body had been discovered and that the investigation was now a murder inquiry, his demeanor changed. Garrison consulted with his lawyer and agreed to provide information in exchange for immunity from prosecution for his involvement in events from the 1970s. Nguyen could not offer such immunity unilaterally, but she agreed to convey his offer to prosecutors. After weeks of negotiation, a deal was reached. Garrison would provide full and truthful testimony about Richard Ashford's death and the criminal network involved, and in exchange, he would not be prosecuted for his role in those events. What Garrison revealed over multiple interviews conducted in May and June 2025 confirmed much of what Nguyen and Wellington had suspected and filled in the remaining gaps in the story. According to Garrison, Richard Ashford had been recruited by Viktor Sokolov's organization in 1970 to facilitate money laundering operations. Richard had initially cooperated voluntarily, attracted by the promise of substantial financial rewards. But as he became more deeply involved, he realized the true nature of the organization he was dealing with and understood that he was in over his head. By mid-1972, Richard was desperate to extricate himself. He had attempted to cover his tracks by embezzling bank funds to replace money that he had diverted to criminal accounts, thinking he could hide the diversion long enough to figure out how to escape the organization's control. But ASIO's investigation and internal bank audits were closing in, and Richard knew that exposure was imminent. Richard had approached Sokolov and begged for help escaping Australia before he was arrested. Sokolov had appeared to agree, promising to provide Richard with false documents and transportation out of the country. The meeting on the afternoon of August 15th had been Richard receiving what he believed were his escape documents and final instructions. But Sokolov had no intention of allowing Richard to escape. Richard knew too much about the organization's operations, about the people involved, about the methods they used. If he was arrested and interrogated, he might reveal information that would bring down the entire network. Sokolov had decided that Richard had to be eliminated. According to Garrison, who had been present at the meeting, Sokolov had told Richard to go to a warehouse in Botany, where a boat would be waiting to take him out of Australia. Richard, desperate and trusting that his only chance of survival lay in cooperating with Sokolov, had followed the instructions. When he arrived at the warehouse, he had been attacked by 2 men working for Sokolov. He had been struck in the head and killed, his body transported to the Parramatta construction site and buried that same night. The embezzlement had been allowed to be discovered the following day, providing a perfect explanation for Richard's disappearance. Everyone would assume he had fled with the stolen money. No one would seriously investigate the possibility that he had been murdered. The organization would be protected. The money laundering operations could continue, and Richard Ashford would be remembered not as a victim, but as a criminal and a coward who had abandoned his family. Garrison's testimony provided the final piece of the puzzle. After more than 50 years, the full truth about Richard Ashford's fate was finally known. He had been murdered on August 15, 1972, by members of a Soviet organized crime network, his body buried in a shallow grave, his reputation destroyed by a cover story that had successfully deceived investigators and the public for more than half a century. With Garrison's testimony and the forensic evidence from the burial site, prosecutors determined that they had sufficient evidence to pursue charges against anyone still living who had been involved in Richard's murder. But of the individuals Garrison identified, most were deceased. Only one was still alive, a man named Dmitry Volkov, who had been one of the 2 men who actually killed Richard. Volkov was located living under an assumed name in Perth, where he had lived quietly for decades, supporting himself with a small business and appearing to be an ordinary retired immigrant. He was arrested in July 2025 and charged with murder. At 81 years old, Volkov became one of the oldest people ever to face trial for murder in Australian legal history. The trial took place in Sydney in early 2026, attracting significant media attention. Victoria Ashford Thompson attended every day of the trial, sitting in the courtroom and watching as the details of her father's death were laid out in testimony and evidence. It was painful and difficult, but she felt she owed it to her father to be present, to bear witness to the truth finally being revealed. Dmitry Volkov, through his lawyer, attempted to argue that he had been following orders from Viktor Sokolov and that he had feared for his own life if he had refused. But the prosecution argued successfully that Volkov had willingly participated in a brutal murder and had lived free for 50 years, while Richard Ashford's family suffered without knowing the truth. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning a verdict of guilty. Dmitry Volkov was sentenced to 25 years in prison, though given his age, it was unlikely he would live long enough to serve the full sentence. Justice, delayed by more than 5 decades, had finally been served. For Victoria Ashford Thompson, the trial brought a measure of closure. She could now properly mourn her father, understanding that he had not been the villain she had sometimes believed him to be. He had made terrible mistakes, had gotten involved with dangerous people, had committed crimes, but he had also been a victim, murdered when he tried to escape the consequences of those mistakes. Richard's remains were finally given a proper burial in a cemetery in Sydney, with a headstone bearing his name and dates. Victoria, her brother James, and their families attended the small funeral service, marking the end of a story that had begun on a hot August afternoon in 1972 and had finally concluded in a courtroom more than 50 years later. The money that Richard had embezzled, or most of it, was never recovered. It remained somewhere in the international banking system, possibly in Swiss accounts that would never be traced, possibly dispersed through channels that left no trail. Viktor Sokolov's criminal organization had long since dissolved, its members dead or scattered, its operations replaced by new networks with new methods. But the Richard Ashford case had become part of Australian criminal history, a cautionary tale about the dangers of involvement with organized crime, about the limits of investigation in an era before modern surveillance and forensic techniques, and about the persistence required to finally uncover the truth, even when decades had passed. Detective Senior Constable Lisa Nguyen received commendations for her work on the case, which was considered one of the most significant cold case successes in New South Wales police history. Dr. Marcus Wellington published a book about the case, detailing the full story from Richard's recruitment, by the criminal organization through the eventual discovery of his remains and the trial of his murderer. Margaret Spencer, Richard's former secretary, died peacefully in 2026, just months after Volkov's conviction. She had lived long enough to see the truth revealed, and to know that she had played a crucial role in finally bringing justice for Richard and his family. Catherine Ashford, who had died in 1987 never knowing what had happened to her husband, was finally vindicated in a sense. She had always believed that Richard had not simply abandoned his family, that something terrible had happened to him. Her instincts had been correct, even though she had not lived to see them confirmed. The case left many with a sense of tragedy mixed with justice. Justice for Richard Ashford, murdered for knowing too much. Justice for his family, who had lived with uncertainty and shame for more than 50 years. But tragedy, too, for a man whose mistakes had cost him his life, for a family torn apart by events beyond their control, for all the years of suffering that might have been avoided if the truth had been discovered sooner. The Commonwealth Banking Corporation building on Martin Place, where Richard Ashford had worked and from which he had walked out for the last time on August 15, 1972, still stood, though the bank itself had long since merged with other institutions and changed its name multiple times. The building had been renovated and modernized, but the marble floors and Art Deco details remained, silent witnesses to all the human dramas that had unfolded within its walls over the decades. And somewhere in Switzerland, in numbered accounts protected by secrecy laws that had been slightly relaxed, but never fully dismantled, millions of dollars sat waiting. Stolen money that had cost Richard Ashford his life, money that would never be returned to its rightful owners, money that represented both temptation and tragedy, a reminder that the pursuit of wealth could lead to destruction, and that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually come to light. The Richard Ashford case was finally closed in 2026, more than 54 years after it began, a testament to the persistence of those who sought truth and justice, and a reminder that even the coldest cases could be solved with new evidence, new technology, and investigators willing to look beyond the obvious explanations to find the darker truths that lay buried beneath decades of lies and silence.